Have you ever wondered how a woman could rise to be queen, only to be destroyed by the very crown she wore? Anne Boleyn wasn't just another royal name in a dusty history book. She was loved. She was feared. And in the end, she was betrayed, so deeply that even her last breath echoed with injustice. You've heard of Henry VIII, the king who changed the church for love. But how well do you know the woman who made him do it? This story isn't just about politics or power. It's about a girl who grew into a woman, sharp, clever, and full of spirit, in a world that had no place for such women unless they stayed silent. And did not. She didn't walk the usual path. She didn't wait to be chosen. She demanded to be seen, and that was her greatest danger. Because in Tudor England, a woman with a voice was a threat. And Anne's voice? It echoed through every hallway of court, stirring jealousy, awe, and fear. But who was she, really? Not just the queen who was executed. Not just the wife who failed to give Henry a son. There's a deeper story, one hidden beneath centuries of gossip, slander, and fear. What if the truth is softer than history tells? What if Anne was never the villain, but the victim? In this journey, we won't just retell old facts. We'll walk beside Anne, from the quiet gardens of her childhood to the cold stone of the tower. We'll feel the silk of her gowns, hear the hush of court whispers, and see the moment the world turned against her. You'll learn what she lost, what she risked, and the lies that shape her fate. So stay with me till the end. Because what history erased, we are about to uncover. Before the jewels, the crown, and the sword, there was just Anne. She was born in a quiet corner of England, in a moated manor called Hever Castle. Surrounded by green fields and silent woods, and spent her early years far from the noise of court. Life at Hever was peaceful, but it was never simple. Her family was ambitious, always watching the winds of power shift in London. Even as a child, Anne was not sheltered from the idea that life could change in an instant, if only one played the game right. She was the second daughter, not quite the heir, not quite invisible. But even then, Anne had something different. A spark, a restlessness in her eyes. She didn't just want to watch the world, she wanted to shape it. When she was still young, her father, Thomas Boleyn, sent her to the Netherlands, and then to the glittering courts of France. There, everything changed. In France, Anne wasn't just taught how to behave like a lady. She learned languages, music, dancing, and diplomacy. But more than anything, she learned how power moved quietly through silk and smiles. She watched queens and mistresses, saints and sinners, all fighting silent wars in the court shadows. She saw how a woman's charm could shift empires, and how quickly that charm could turn to danger. She learned to speak with elegance, to listen before answering, to walk like she owned the room, even if she didn't. These weren't just lessons in manners. They were survival. And returned to England as something unfamiliar. She was not the soft, obedient girl the court expected. She was witty, sharp, and confident in ways that unsettled many. She laughed too freely. She looked men in the eyes. She didn't lower her voice. Some found her magnetic. Others found her dangerous. But Anne didn't shrink. She took her place in Queen Catherine of Aragon's household as a lady-in-waiting. And there, quietly, she watched another queen rule, a woman both loved and pitied, caught in the web of duty and fading favor. And noticed how loyalty was expected, but rarely returned. She saw the loneliness that even a crown couldn't protect against. And perhaps, somewhere deep inside, she began to wonder, could she do it differently? Could she, one day, wear that crown, not by birth, but by choice? Anne's early life wasn't a fairy tale. It was a careful balancing act between expectation and ambition. She was raised to charm, but also to think. She was taught to serve, but also to scheme. Every move she made had meaning. Every word she spoke carried weight. She wasn't innocent, but she wasn't cruel. She was a girl growing into a woman, in a world that judged women far too quickly and forgave them far too late. In the long halls of Hever, in the glitter of French court, and in the quiet corners of Queen Catherine's chambers, and learned who she was. And maybe more importantly, she learned who she was not. She was not patient. She was not passive. And she would never be silent. That fire, once lit, would carry her straight into the heart of history. But fire, as you'll soon see, always comes with a cost. It began with a glance. Not love, not even desire. Just a glance, sharp, lingering, curious, and had returned to court with her French polish, her confident stride, and her eyes that held something unreadable. She was assigned again to Queen Catherine's household, and there, in the background, she watched the king. Henry VIII was tall, charming, full of life. He was a man who believed the world bent for him, and most of the time, it did. He had already taken Anne's sister, Mary, as his mistress. That path was clear. That role was known. But Anne refused. She would not be just another woman in Henry's bed. Not a shadow in her own sister's story. Not a name whispered and forgotten. Henry sent gifts, and sent them back. He wrote letters. She let them wait. He watched her at court events, and she smiled, but never stepped forward. She danced with other men. She laughed too loudly. She kept him close, but never close enough. And that made him want her more. No one had told Henry no. No woman had dared, and was not cruel. But she was calculated. She knew what it meant to hold a king's heart in her hand. She didn't want to be a mistress. If she was going to risk everything, it would be for everything. Queen or nothing, she once said. And she meant it. The court began to whisper. Some called her a witch, said she had cast a spell. Others said she was arrogant, reckless, dangerous. But behind the gossip was fear, because Anne wasn't playing the game like a woman. She was playing like a man. Henry, meanwhile, was becoming obsessed. His letters grew more passionate, more desperate. He promised her marriage, promised her the throne, promised her a future no woman outside royalty had ever dared to imagine. But there was one problem. He was still married. Catherine of Aragon had been queen for over 20 years. She was beloved by the people. She had borne Henry a daughter, and she refused to step aside. Henry's love for and began to change something bigger, something darker. He started questioning the marriage itself, claiming it had never been valid. He appealed to the Pope. He searched for loopholes in Scripture. And all the while, and waited. She waited in the background, never publicly demanding anything, but always present, always just out of reach. The years dragged on. The tension grew. Henry's frustration deepened, not just with Catherine, but with the Church, with Rome, with any power that stood between him and Anne. And Anne, she stood her ground. Imagine the weight of that choice. To risk your name, your safety, your soul, because you would not accept less, because you believed you were meant for more. It wasn't just passion between them. It was ambition, rebellion, and danger. And didn't seduce the king with softness. She seduced him with strength. And in doing so, she began to unravel the world around her. This wasn't love in the way stories tell it. This was war dressed as romance. And the cost had only just begun. She had won. After nearly 7 years of waiting, whispering, and watching from the edges, Anne Boleyn stood where no woman like her had stood before, beside the king, as his wife. As Queen of England. Catherine was gone. Cast aside, quietly and bitterly. The Church had been broken. Rome had been rejected. Henry had torn down centuries of tradition for Anne. And so, on a summer day in 1533, she was crowned. Her coronation was not a quiet affair. It was bold, golden, defiant. Trumpets rang. Crowds gathered. Banners flew. She wore crimson and gold, and the crown of St. Edward rested heavy on her dark hair. It had been made for a king. Now, it sat upon her. But beneath the surface, the air was colder. The people had not forgotten Catherine. Many still saw and as the woman who broke a sacred marriage. They called her names. They muttered as her carriage passed. To some, she was not a queen. She was the reason England had turned its back on God. And heard them. She smiled anyway, because she had something far more precious than their approval. She had hope. She was carrying a child. And not just any child, and believed it would be a son. The heir Henry had waited so long for. The answer to every question. The seal to her victory. The court buzzed with expectations. Henry was jubilant, and glowed with confidence. She was no longer waiting, no longer whispering. She gave orders. She made enemies. She moved through the palace like she had always belonged there. But power can be lonely. Her old friends kept their distance. Catherine's allies watched with cold eyes. Jane Seymour, quiet and pale, had joined the court as a lady-in-waiting. She said little. She bowed low. But her presence, soft as it seemed, was a shadow stretching slowly across Anne's light. Then came the day, September 7th, and gave birth not to a son, but to a daughter. A girl named Elizabeth. Beautiful, healthy, bright-eyed. But not the answer Henry had demanded, and hid her disappointment, though it gnawed at her. She said the next would be a boy. She believed it. She had to. But things began to shift. Henry's affection cooled. Not overnight. Not completely. But enough for Anne to feel it. The court, always watching, noticed. The whispers returned. And had climbed too high, they said. She had forgotten her place. She was proud. She was dangerous. She had changed the world, and now the world wanted her to fall. Still, Anne tried. She pushed harder. She involved herself in politics. She spoke too freely. She argued with Henry's advisors. She made demands where other queens had bowed. But each move only added weight to the crown. It was once her prize. Now, it pressed down like iron. Anne was queen. She had everything she once dreamed of: power, status, glory. But her joy was always walking beside fear. She had seen what court could do to those who displeased the king. And now, she was no longer the mystery he couldn't have. She was his wife. And that, in Henry's world, made her replaceable. And smiled in public. She held Elizabeth close. She whispered hope into the future. But deep down, something had changed. She had won the crown. But somewhere in her heart, she must have known her victory would never be safe, and was still queen. But something had changed. The court no longer buzzed with wonder. Now, it whispered behind her back. Her laughter echoed less. Her steps felt heavier. And the king, he was no longer watching her the way he once had. Her daughter, Elizabeth, was healthy and bright. But she was not a boy. Not the heir Henry had torn the kingdom apart for, and knew she needed to try again, quickly. A son would save her. A son would make it all worth it. But the next pregnancy ended in a miscarriage. Then another. Each loss carved away her hope. Each moment of pain was followed by silence from the king. His face grew colder. His visits shorter. He stopped sharing his thoughts. He stopped sharing his warmth. And someone else began to appear. Jane Seymour. Quiet, pale, obedient, everything and was not. She stood in the background, just as Anne once had, waiting, listening, smiling softly. Henry noticed. And noticed too. She tried to win him back. She wore the dresses he once admired. She spoke the clever words he once praised. She begged for his attention with the same fire that once made her queen. But fire, when spent, leaves only ashes. Henry began spending more time away. He no longer needed Anne to defy the church. He had his heir, even if it was a girl. He had a new power. And now, he wanted peace, obedience, simplicity, and was never simple. And the court knew it. Enemies who had waited patiently now stepped forward. They reminded the king of Anne's sharp tongue, her meddling in politics, her bold opinions. They whispered about her flirtations, her friendships with other men. They questioned her loyalty, her virtue, even her soul. Some even spoke of witchcraft, and felt it closing in. The coldness, the silence, the shift in eyes as she passed. Her power, once bright and burning, now flickered like a candle in the wind. And yet, she held her head high. She had fought too hard, lost too much, to crumble now. She still believed she could recover. That another son would come. That Henry would remember the love that once set the world on fire. But in early 1536, she suffered her final miscarriage. The child, it was said, had been a boy. And something inside and broke. The same day, Catherine of Aragon died. Henry wore yellow, smiled in public, and claimed it was for their daughter. But many believed it was for something else, the freedom to finally leave and, just as he had once left Catherine. Anne's enemies moved quickly. The king's eyes were now on Jane. His heart, if it could still be called that, was elsewhere, and stood alone, surrounded by wolves. She had once been untouchable. Now, she was vulnerable. The very court she had conquered had turned against her. And somewhere deep inside, and must have known, the fall had begun. Not with a scream, but with silence. It happened fast. One day, and was queen. The next, she was a prisoner. In May of 1536, she was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, the same place where she had once stayed before her coronation. Then, it had been full of hope. Now, it was full of fear. The charges came like a storm. Adultery, incest, treason. They said she had been unfaithful with multiple men, that she had plotted the king's death, that she had committed unnatural sins. The accusations were wild, cruel, impossible, but they didn't have to be true. They only had to be useful. 5 men were arrested with her, including her own brother, George. All of them were accused of terrible things. None of them had real evidence against them. But evidence didn't matter. The decision had already been made. Henry wanted her gone, and stood trial before a room full of nobles. Some had once bowed to her, others had always hated her. Now, they watched her with cold, curious eyes. She defended herself with grace and courage. She denied every charge. She reminded them of her loyalty, her faith, her love for the king. She spoke clearly. She looked her judges in the eye. But it didn't change anything. The verdict was guilty. The sentence, death, and was taken back to her rooms in the tower. She prayed. She wept. She laughed at strange moments, caught between disbelief and despair. She asked for her innocence to be remembered. She forgave those who judged her. She forgave Henry. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn walked out into the cold morning light. She wore a simple grey gown. Her dark hair was tucked beneath a white coif. Her hands were steady. She knelt before the French executioner, brought specially so the death would be swift, clean, and silent. She spoke to the small crowd. She did not curse the king. She did not cry. She said only that she was ready to die, that she prayed God would save the king and forgive her. Then, with one stroke of a sword, it was over. She was just 35. The men accused with her had died first, silenced, erased. Her brother, her friends, names swallowed by the same silence that took her. But and left behind something stronger than silence. She left behind a daughter, Elizabeth, the child no one had wanted, the girl who would grow up motherless, the girl who would become queen. Not just any queen, but one of the greatest in English history. And so, Anne's death was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of her legacy. But that legacy came at a terrible cost. A woman punished for ambition, for intelligence, for refusing to accept her place. She had been the reason Henry broke with the church, the woman he moved heaven and earth to possess. And yet, when he tired of her, he destroyed her without mercy. Was she perfect? No. But was she guilty? Or was she simply inconvenient? History often blames her, or forgets her, or reshapes her into something easier to explain. But here, in her final moments, stripped of power and title, she showed us the truth. She was brave. She was human. And she died with her head held high. And Boleyn died on a cold scaffold, but her story didn't end there. In a quiet corner of the royal palace, her daughter grew up, Elizabeth, the girl no one celebrated, the child of a disgraced queen. She watched, listened, and learned. She carried her mother's name like a secret flame. And one day, that flame lit a throne. Elizabeth became queen in 1558. She ruled for 45 years. She was clever, powerful, and unshakable. She chose never to marry. She answered to no man. Under her rule, England thrived. She became Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the woman who defied every expectation. And in her strength, many saw Anne. They saw the sharp mind, the steady will, the courage to stand alone. Though mother and daughter never shared more than a few short years together, their stories were bound, 2 women who changed the world by refusing to be silent. But for centuries, Anne's name remained stained. She was called a seductress, a witch, a traitor. Her enemies painted her with harsh strokes, and history repeated those lies. She was blamed for breaking a marriage, for leading a king astray, for reaching too high. It was easier, perhaps, to make her the villain. But time has a way of softening hard stories, of asking new questions. Historians have looked again at the records, the letters, the trial. They've found gaps, contradictions, moments that don't add up. They've found the human beneath the legend, and was not perfect. She was ambitious, proud, sometimes sharp with her words, but she was also smart, loyal, brave in a world that punished women for thinking too much and asking too loudly. She didn't rise through seduction alone. She rose through wit and charm, learning how to navigate a world built to exclude her. She became queen not by accident, but through her refusal to settle for less. And when the world turned on her, she stood tall. Even in death, she left behind something greater than grief. She left a legacy of courage. Today, many remember her not just as a tragic figure, but as a symbol. A woman who dared. A woman who changed history. A woman whose voice, though silenced, still echoes. Her story speaks to anyone who has ever been underestimated, to anyone who's been told to stay quiet, to any girl who was ever punished for being too bold, too bright, too much. Anne's life reminds us that history is not only written by kings. It is shaped by women who refuse to be forgotten. So the next time someone speaks of Anne Boleyn, don't just remember the crown, or the trial, or the sword. Remember the girl at Hever, dreaming of more. Remember the woman who stood at the center of power, unafraid. Remember the mother whose daughter led an empire. And Boleyn was loved. She was feared. She was betrayed. But more than anything, she endures. If this story moved you, imagine how many more are hidden, whispers lost in royal halls and pages left unread. So, if you crave untold stories, dark truths, and the shadows behind the crown, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. Now let me ask you this. Was Anne Boleyn a victim of power, or a woman who dared too much? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. Thanks for watching. See you in the next story that history forgot to tell.